And Dave, if you would help by admitting people, that would be great while I talk.
Will do.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to 2022. It's getting hard to say that, but welcome to the new year. Welcome to NWSA, the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, our wilderness webinars, where we try to bring you some information about the latest in wilderness stewardship, interesting topics that affect both wilderness stewards, wilderness managers, things that would affect your volunteer work, as well as things that affect the agency and their management of wilderness. Today, that's one of the topics that we have on our calendar, is a look at the pack stock regulations in both BLM and U.S. Forest Service wildernesses. As you know, pack stock regulations can be a quite touchy subject depending on your audience. Some people just perfectly enjoy the use of pack stock. Some people just don't like to see stock in wilderness. And so today we're going to be exploring both the philosophy as well as the regulations that limit or allow the use of pack stock. We're going to look at how pack stock regulations are the same or different within BLM and Forest Service wilderness. We hope to have some discussion about some of the conclusions and findings that have been found by our speaker. And with us today, we have Dr. Griff Griffin from Grand Valley State University. Griff is a professor of natural resources management there at Grand Valley. He's been actively teaching people over the last 25 years in natural resources issues and programs, so a wealth of experience. Griff has done some research looking at the stock regulations between the BLM and the Forest Service. She's going to share those results with us today, what their implications are. And then also with us, we have Randy Rasmussen, who is the Director for Public Lands and Recreation of the Backcountry Horsemen of America, to provide some color commentary to provide us with a better understanding of what the impacts of some of these regulations are on stock users. I think that's one of the things we realize is that over time, the number of people that are maybe understanding of pack stock and their use on the national forest is declining. And we don't want that decline of use to be indicative of a lack of importance or a lack of understanding. But so we offer this particular webinar up as a way for people to better understand the use and role of pack stock in wilderness, and then regulations that managers have put in place, how those are affecting that use, and what the long-term implications might be. So with that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and turn our time over to Griff and allow her to share the results of her research, and then Randy will join us as the webinar unfolds. So everybody sit back and let's listen to a wonderful presentation. Griff, take it away.
Randy, weren't you going to run the poll?
Oh yeah, I do want to run the poll.
So while he's doing the poll, the other Randy was going to come on and also say a few words before I start.
Yeah, okay. And so this poll that we would like to do right now is just to help the speakers get a feel for the audience. And so we have two questions. The first question is, what's your affiliation or interest in regard to pack stock regulations? And you'll identify kind of where you are at with your affiliation by agency or steward or other. And then the second question is about how knowledgeable you think you currently are with pack stock use or regulations in wilderness. And so would you guys go ahead now and answer these two questions? You'll maybe have to scroll through to show them, but both questions are identified. And nobody's doing it yet, but take a look at it. So what's your affiliation? either as an agency, an academic, scientist, a steward, volunteer, or other? And then how knowledgeable are you with pack stock use and regulations currently? So go ahead and continue to answer both questions. We're almost there, up to about 70% of you. If we can get the last few participants to respond to the poll, that will help us, help our speakers assess the audience going forward. Okay, I think we're pretty close to there. I'm going to share the results now. So with our first question of what's our affiliation, about 3 of the 18 are agency reps. 13 of the 18 that responded are wilderness stewards, volunteers, or visitors. We've got a scientist and an other. In terms of how knowledgeable people feel, as an agency rep, feeling pretty knowledgeable, as a steward feeling somewhat knowledgeable, as a user having some knowledge, but at least 5 people recognizing that they could learn more. All right, so Griff or Randy, you wanted to say some final statements before you jumped in? Some opening statements before you jump in to the presentation?
Yeah, you bet. This is Randy Rasmussen, BCHA. Just wanted to make a couple distinctions too, because what the thrust of Griff's presentation is going to be is just in terms of wilderness character monitoring is what the federal agencies are tasked to do, is the differences in how they're going about looking at the restrictions to stock use. She's not qualifying they're good or bad, or they're needed or not needed, but really, looking at this from a perspective of when folks are ranking trends, starting from a baseline on a wilderness character and out into the future here, how will the agencies define this, wilderness, among other things, the Wilderness Act, as it provides outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. When we talk about what is unconfined type of recreation, one thing that we know confines recreation is regulations, and that's what Griff is going to get in on here. We at this point won't be making distinctions of the different types of pack stock use. I mean, of course, in any given wilderness, we have a combination of commercial pack stock use from outfitters, guides, etc. We have the administrative use that the agency's own wranglers and folks use, and then we have the private uses, which largely is the folks I represent, the good men and women of backcountry horsemen of America. But each of those, are different, but in the public side, it's not always, that's not always the case. But I hope folks, hear that we're coming from perspective of the use of pack stock, is a minimum impact traditional tool in wilderness. And I'm sure, and I hope you'll agree that pack stock in wilderness, the use of pack stock reinforces our connection with our ancestors and our heritage. And so irrespective of how you feel about pack stock use, that's the perspective that I'm coming from, the color commentary I would want to provide if we have time for discussion and question and answer. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to turn it over to Griff.
And I'll note before Griff starts that we are recording the session. It will be available for review at the later in the week and on file with our NWSA website. And we will allow time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions as they come up, please enter them into the chat, and we will queue those up for a time at the end of the presentation. So Griff, thank you so much for being here, and go ahead and take it away.
Happy to be here. All right. That seemed like, yep, okay. So wilderness character, each agency is tasked with defining and quantifying wilderness character. There are 5 characteristics of wilderness character, and as Randy alluded to, I'm only going to focus on one, the solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. Even in that solitude and primitive and unconfined recreation, I'm not focused on solitude. I'm only focused on unconfined recreation. So what is unconfined recreation? It's basically no rules. In a perfect world, we would have no rules. It would be completely unconfined recreation. So I've given you 2 trailhead kiosks where you can clearly see rules and regulations. The one on the left, Mount Hood, you need wilderness permits. There's a group size limit. The one on the right, Mount Rainier National Park, there's a whole bunch of things that you can't do in wilderness. So those are examples of rules that confine user behavior. One of the things about rules is they always involve trade-offs. So those of you who have ever been near a body of water know that laughter actually does travel really clearly across a lake. You can hear the people on the other side of the lake really well, as if they were right next to you. So one of the things that you think about when you're making a rule, if you're the manager, particularly for things like camping setbacks, if you make the rule, the great news is it will promote solitude, because then the people across the lake won't hear you. If you have setbacks, you can camp 200 feet away from the lake. It promotes a more natural lake shore. The downside of that rule is it confines recreation. So whenever a manager makes a choice to do a rule, they might do something that is positive for wilderness character, while at the same time it's negative for another component of wilderness character. If you don't have any rules, yay, you have unconfined recreation. But you potentially, if users aren't well behaved, follow leave not trace principles, or if use levels are high, you can negatively affect solitude or naturalness. Okay, so why are we even talking about stock? We're talking about stock because you'll see that the Forest Service and the BLM manage most of the wilderness in the United States in terms of the number of wildernesses. The second most common set of rules has to do with stock use. The most common rule in wilderness is group size limits. So I'm going to look at it as a dualistic. Either there are group size limits or there aren't group size limits. Either there are stock limits or there are not stock limits. So let me just make a little aside about whether a rule is a big deal. Most group size limits are like 12. And we know from the research that most groups going out in wilderness are like 2 or 3. So the rule, even though the rule does confine recreation, for 99% of the visitors, it doesn't even matter that you have a group size rule, because most of them go out with just a friend or 2. But what the managers are doing is everybody will say large groups, we don't like to encounter large groups. So it's designed to protect the users from that experience, even though the rule doesn't really affect very many people. So, okay, back to stock. We're focused on stock because it's one of the most common rules that you can expect to find in wilderness. So there's 2 research questions. What kinds of rules about stock can you expect to find in the BLM and Forest Service? And are there differences between those 2 agencies? So why do rules matter? Well, remember back to wilderness character. The goal is for people to have an unconfined recreational experience, which means you'd like to take your horse out there in the wilderness and have no rules. That's the goal. we can't always achieve it. And I told you why, because it sometimes if we don't do a rule, other parts of wilderness character are affected. One of the things about a rule is if you have a rule, it shouldn't be a secret. You really should have it visible to people. For one thing, people need to plan ahead and prepare. If you have a rule that says no dogs, it doesn't do any good if the person doesn't know the rule until they show up at the trailhead, right? That's too late for them because then they have to either violate the rule or like hope they have a dog leash in the car. So you need people to, if you're going to have a rule, you need people to be able to access that rule before they go on the trip. So agencies, from an agency perspective, if they're going to enforce the rule, they need clear rules that visitors understand, because otherwise enforcement gets to be a challenge. So I alluded to this earlier. The reason I'm focused on the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service is they have the vast majority of wilderness when you talk about the numbers of wilderness as opposed to acreage. Most of the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service wilderness is in Alaska. So, oh, come on. So the methods, how did I go about this project? Well, ideally, the way I would go about this project is I would go to the BLM website for a wilderness and I'd look at the rules there. And I would do the same thing for the Forest Service. So I've done that. And it is a mixed bag at best. On a good day, overwhelmingly, if you want to know if there are rules, you can go to the Forest Service website and chances are you might find it. If you are going to go to a BLM wilderness and you go to the BLM website, chances are really good you will not find the rules on their website. Does that mean that the BLM doesn't have rules? Not necessarily, but because the BLM is not traditionally posting their rules on the website, that's a terrible source of data for me. So strike that out. I could look at Forest Service orders. That works, but there is no equivalent to the BLM. So I can't really use that as a data set. I could use the kiosk at the trailhead, but no one can plan ahead if the only place the rule is posted at the trailhead. So what that always brings me back to is wilderness.net. If you do, I had my students in class search all the BLM wildernesses. And the number one website that shows up in the search is wilderness.net. So if a user was looking, that would be the first place that they would be directed to, over the Forest Service and over the BLM. Those are secondary searches. I mean, the first result is wilderness.net. The agency website are secondary. That's good or bad, it depends, but know that people are going to wilderness.net. So that's where I went. I went to wilderness.net. There are a bunch of other unofficial websites, unofficial as in not government websites, but I would not expect them to be talking about the rules for the wilderness. So wasn't a place to go. So the place I went is wilderness.net. When you go to wilderness.net, Wilderness Connect, there's a place on there that says rules and regulations. So you just click on that and you'll see three kinds of regulations. Regulations that affect all visitors. So that's the first kind. The second kind is overnight visitors. And then the third kind is stock users. So sometimes a rule that affects all visitors, like you can only stay 14 days, that also affects stock users. So it's complicated to do the analysis because you have to figure out whether the rule for all visitors does affect stock users. So that's where I'm getting the data. So I literally look at those rules and code them into a system that you're going to see in a second. So here are some methodological challenges associated with this process. So first, is that a rule? Most of you would say, yes, that looks like a rule. That looks like an enforceable rule. Check. That's an easy one. So I looked at the leave no trace for stock users. It says use certified weed seed free hay. Is that a rule? Now, it's easy enough to say this is not the agency website, but I'll tell you what some of the agency websites say. This is a direct quote from BLM website. Horses are permitted, however, you may be required to carry weed-free feed. Is that a rule? What does it mean when it says you may be required? How will I know that as a horseback rider before I go there? I mean, so I'm not sure whether that's a rule. And so that makes it very complicated when I start to do some of this analysis, because sometimes I honestly can't tell you if it is a rule or if it's a strong suggestion or if it's a rule sometimes and not a rule other times. I just don't know. Okay, back to wilderness character. Remember, I told you the agencies have to document wilderness character, and for unconfined recreation, the way they do it is they look at rules. So there was a technical guide that was produced, and all the agencies were using this same table, and they were saying these are the most common things that managers use to regulate recreation. So of those most common things, you can see that stock is you can see that stock use is one of the rules. So the rules are weighted. If there's no restriction, that's a 0. We do the happy dance. If we don't allow stock at all, that's a weighting of 3. That's a bad thing. If you're a user, you don't want to see a level 3 restriction. This particular research isn't, except the next slide, I'm not actually going to talk about the weighting. I'm just going to talk about whether they have rules or not. Okay, so now the next slide talks about the difference between the way the BLM does this and the way the Forest Service does it. That table I just showed you, I think their hope was that all agencies were going to use the same weighting scheme. But the reality is they're not using the same weighting scheme. So no restrictions for the BLM on the left, weighted 0, happy dance. Forest Service, weighted 0, happy dance. Grazing by stock prohibited, the BLM only gives that a weighting of 1. If you flip over to the Forest Service, they give that a weighting of 2, right? So they're saying that's a more severe restriction than the BLM does. The same thing happens when you look at no camping with stock. There's a difference between the BLM and the Forest Service. In one case, it's a 3, and in the other case, it's a 4. So the wilderness character stuff, they're very clear. We're not actually comparing one agency to another. What we're doing is we're comparing one agency over time. Is the wilderness character improving for this wilderness? So to some extent, as long as they maintain a consistent methodology, even if it differs between the Forest Service and BLM, it's okay. But it's interesting to me that the stock use is one of the few where they do diverge. They're not the same weighting. So in terms of the BLM and the Forest Service, big picture, 44% of the Forest Service wildernesses have a stock rule. 31% of the BLM wildernesses have a stock rule. So put this in the back of your head. Whatever number I report here is going to always underreport. It will not overreport. Because remember, wilderness.net, it's up to the agency to go in and enter the regulation. So if this particular forest, the person who's in charge of wilderness doesn't put the data in wilderness.net, then rules exist and they're not in wilderness.net. So the numbers I report here are the least amount of regulation. It is more likely there are more wildernesses that have regulation. How many more, I can't tell you, but just know that this is an under, not an over reporting based on the methodology. The most common stock rules that you see between the Forest Service and the BLM, the way that I got the Forest Service and categorized them was a bit different than how I got the BLM ones, but still, you're going to see the most common rule on both sides is a feed restriction. So for the Forest Service, 48, if you had a stock rule for the Forest Service, half of you, the stock rule is you have to use certified weed-free or pellets. Some people could argue that, okay, stock, invasive species, let's do it 100% of the time. Managers are trying not to confine recreators. Are you gonna make a rule before you have a problem? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But one argument could be that you should always make horseback riders bring in weed-free seed. And another argument is, why would you do that until you have a problem? Maybe you're in an area where they are not bringing, the horse use is so low that invasive species aren't a problem. The other common setback, the other common regulation is a setback. So it's a setback from water or a setback from trails. So you'll see that on the left side. So stand back and say, does this match your experience that when you go out and recreate on BLM or Forest Service land, do you usually encounter that rule? So that's part of the, the sort of ground truthing is you as a horseback rider can say, oh yeah, I've been to 25 wildernesses and none of them require that. That's interesting. But for those of you who don't really know which rules are common, those are the most common rules, is certified weed-free feed or stock setbacks from water or stock setbacks from trails. I will say those stock setbacks, they are much the same as the camping setbacks. So if there's a stock setback from water or trails, there's likely to also be hiker setbacks from water or trails. They tend to go together. So on the right, when you look at the BLM one, you can see that there's a bunch of them, like 40%, if you are a BLM wilderness and you have stock rules, 40% of those say that feed may be required, which I don't really know if that's a rule. The other 38% of them are clear. It is a rule. It is actually required. The third one, pack in processed feed such as pellets, grain, or weed-free hay. Is that a rule or a strong suggestion? I don't know. I mean, I actually, as a manager, probably want you to do that, whether it's an enforceable rule or not. But it's unclear sometimes whether those things are rules or not. The second most common rule is a setback, and it's often from water. Leave no trace recommends that people are 200 feet away from water. If you look at the Forest Service total, the things in green are the percent of Forest Service wildernesses that have stock setbacks from water. You can see like setbacks from streams or rivers, 25% of them follow the leave no trace goal of 200 feet back, which means the rest of them are not following that rule. They're less than that rule. Setbacks from lakes, those are more likely. Now we're up to 57%. So leave no traces saying 200 feet, but the rules that are in place are not always the same as what the leave no trace recommends. The BLM, they're kind of all over the map. There are also setbacks from trails and other campsites. Oops. Every time I try to move the little people out of the way, my screen moves. There's a difference between the Forest Service and the BLM. In some cases, the BLM, if they have a setback, the setbacks are pretty far. 400 feet is far away, which is significantly different than the Forest Service. Camping with stock, I actually thought there were going to be more rules that fit in this category, but the reality is that there are not lots of rules that are in this category. They hardly ever are prohibiting stock. And they're hardly ever prohibiting it across the entire wilderness. Forest Service has some seasonal restrictions. Now, if you were to go out there in the field, you might find they have far more seasonal restrictions than what you can see in wilderness.net. But in wilderness.net, they're not even seasonally restricting them very often. Stock use on trails. In some cases, we've got people that are agencies that are restricting stock to certain trails. Some of them make them ride in single file. Some of them prohibit stock on all trails. It's really, 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 really rare. I mean, it is a rare case when they're saying you can't have stock in this wilderness or you can't have stock on trails. That's really rare. It's more common for them to say you can only be on some trails, but even that is pretty rare, and it is more common in the Forest Service than it is in the BLM. Again, assuming that I have perfect information on the BLM, which I don't. Tethering rules. It's always entertaining to read the rules because sometimes they say, oh, no tethering if you're causing damage to live vegetation or soil. I don't want to be the one out in the field trying to enforce whether they're causing damage. Another version of it is no tethering to any vegetation. Another version of the rule is no tethering to live or dead vegetation. So the way they refer to even things like tethering to vegetation is dependent on the specific person in that specific wilderness. Group size limits. For the Forest Service, there are sometimes stock limits with no people limits. In that case, there were 34 wildernesses. In the second row, you can see people limits, but no stock limits. That happened about as often, 29 of the wildernesses. In the third row, people equals stock. So if there was a limit of 12 stock, there was a limit of 12 people. So in some cases, 24 of the wildernesses, they were the same. The fourth row, in 17 of the wildernesses, they'd allowed more people than they allowed stock. And in the fifth row for the Forest Service, in 34 of the cases, they allowed more stock than they allowed people. So it was stock plus 10, or the number of people plus 10. The BLM, there were stock limits in terms of the group size limits for 15 of them, and then 17 of them had limits on the group size. Okay, so what's the big picture summary? 31% of the BLM wildernesses have stock rules. 44% of the Forest Service have stock rules. It's a common rule. The most common rule is a feed restriction. That said, I'm not sure how many of the BLM wildernesses really have real rules or whether they're just, sometimes they have rules. The second most common rule that they've got are setbacks from water, trails, and campsites. flowing water, the setback rule is smaller, like it might only be 100 feet, whereas standing water like lakes, the setback rule tends to be a little bit further. Many of the water setback rules are below the LNT standard. One of the things about that is, I've talked to David Cole, and if you have a mountain and you're in a valley, in some cases, you can't camp because 200 feet away, because you'd be up the mountain. So sometimes that's why they've got 100-foot setback rules. The Forest Service is most likely to restrict riding on some trails in the BLM, but in general, stock are seldom outright prohibited from a wilderness. So I have two sets of recommendations for agencies. One is they should have clear rules that make sense, that are, it's a rule as opposed to a strong suggestion, and you wouldn't have things that say may. The second one, you should have accessible rules. People ought to be able to find the rules before they get to the trailhead. The BLM rules, they're not on their website. I mean, they are in a couple of cases, but in almost every case, the BLM website that you go to will show you the map and it'll tell you how to get there, and there are no rules. So then the question is, should the agency just do what they've done for Leave No Trace? Leave No Trace has been super effective. They've been able to put their 7 principles on most of the agency websites for wilderness. That's great. So maybe they should be driving the user over to wilderness.net. That said, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know whether people are dying to look for rules or not, but at this point, having no rules on your website does the agencies no favors. The third one is, I guess unless someone's got a compelling reason for why the agencies are using 2 different ways of weighting the stock rules, I'm not sure why they're doing that. So I guess I would ask that question. And the fourth one is, it is interesting to see group size differences or setback differences between hikers and horse users. In some cases, they allow bigger group sizes for horse users than they do for hikers. In some cases, hikers get a bigger group size than horses. Setback restrictions are the same way. Sometimes they're more restrictive for horses and sometimes they're less restrictive, or they're the same restrictive. So it's something that I don't know whether a wilderness is internally consistent. And I don't know whether they're doing that based on biophysical impacts, or honestly, somebody created a rule and then 10 years later, somebody created a different rule, and they didn't actually look to see and strategize whether the rules should be the same. So don't get, I mean, I would urge you not to get lost in the details between 17% have a setback from this versus 21% have a setback from this. It's a big picture kind of analysis. These are the ways that they're regulating horseback use across all wildernesses. You as a horseback rider would know that the National Park Service is far, far, far more restrictive, as is the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you were to go to either of those 2 wildernesses, I would have very, very different results, because they have completely different mandates than the Forest Service or the BLM. That's it. I've talked as fast as I possibly can. This is my favorite hike in the whole world. This is Butler Gulch in Colorado.
All right, Griff, thank you so much. So Randy Rasmussen, were you going to provide some comments as well?
Well, I can. It's a lot to digest, and this is kind of a global, state of the wilderness review. So clearly, we have such a wide range of regulations. and lots of questions, obviously, that could, come from that. But clearly, a lot of those differences in regulations, not so much between agencies, but just across the national wilderness preservation system, is going to reflect those diverse ecosystems and the whole variety of things from Mojave Desert to, alpine tundra type of environments. So I'm not so much, at this point curious about why certain regulations are there on the books or questioning their need. I guess, certainly from the perspective of backcountry horsemen, we understand that, oftentimes, but not always, regulations are necessary for pack stock. When I say pack stock, I'm talking primarily, exclusively horses and mules. That, large group size, things like that. Yes, that decreases other visitor solitude, maybe even our own on pack trips. And there could also increase physical impacts from, large group size. But I think Griff is correct for the most part. For the private horsemen and women, group size limits don't really affect us in a negative way, because we're not the commercial outfitters that have, different reasons for group size needs or whatnot to keep their businesses, afloat. So, but we do as private users, of our wilderness areas, in this case, BLM and Forest Service, certainly would like to question, certain restrictions. And clearly, if there is a need proven either through the social sciences or physical sciences that stock use is causing an adverse impact and negatively affecting wilderness character, if that argument can be made and demonstrated, I think most of our ranks within backcountry horsemen would say, we get it. We may not always like some of those restrictions, but we get the science behind it and the need to preserve wilderness character. It's those cases where there's not necessarily that direct linkage. I have several examples in my head, but I won't spend time right now going over that, where there are certain restrictions in wilderness that don't have really any basis other than, horses poop. And, we know from the science of today versus the science from the 70s that, horse manure is, in terms of carrying pathogen, is almost a non-issue. Pathogens, come from mammals like us, like our dogs, like the Belding's gray squirrel or the avian species or other things, where it's not so much the pathogen issue, which we know many of our wilderness managers are concerned about. It's our own. In the bottom line, you have people like Rob Atwell from University of California, Davis, and others say point blank, it's your own sanitation practices when you're out in the wilderness that are going to define whether these pathogens might, negatively affect you over time. It's not going to be stock users for the most part in 99+% of cases. So part of our role in BCHA is trying to dispel some of those old time myths, again, contain pathogens and horse manure, and come at it with the science to say, okay, if it's based on current science, we get it. How can we help? How can we make the conditions better, or in this case, improve wilderness character? And Griff is correct also. Well, I'm probably talking too long here. I don't want to try to generalize a lot of things other than saying, we live with regulations. Certainly having them more explicit is something that all our membership wants, and a one-stop shop like wilderness.net would be wonderful, instead of the various ways our members get information about what they can expect or what regulations, especially if they're traveling and they're not familiar with a given wilderness unit and its management requirements. A lot of guessing can ruin a trip if you trailer your animals long distances just to find out there's restrictions you weren't otherwise aware. So I really support Griff's recommendation about making more explicit, both agencies in this case, about what those regulations, so we have a one-stop shop for getting that type of information. So I'll leave it at that.
Lisa's on this call, and she probably would be very happy if agencies kept wilderness.net up to date.
Yeah, she's doing a great job. That's a great resource.
I was gonna make that point. As people begin to think about the questions that they might have, our audience is small enough that we can go ahead and have you ask those questions in person. So if you do have a question, go ahead and just raise your hand. Use the raise your hand feature to be recognized, and we'll let you ask your question, or you can type it into the chat function and we'll address either way. But yeah, with Lisa on the line, it would be nice to hear from her about wilderness.net. I can say from experience that wilderness.net was set up by the agencies back in the early 2000s to be a one-stop shopping center for all things wilderness, both the laws, the regulations, the rules. And it does take the agency individual units to update information to make it useful. But it was intended to be the primary place where people, the public, could find out information about each wilderness area. Lisa, would you like to just speak to that fact for our audience?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I do appreciate both your comments, Randy, and Griff's as well. We definitely still rely on the agencies to provide information each year. Generally, for the Forest Service, this often happens through the upward reporting process. There's a request as part of the upward reporting process that units look at the information on Wilderness Connect and then contact me if there are edits that need to be made. So that does routinely happen. The other agencies, I will say, have been a little bit more problematic over the years to be cooperative in submitting their information and making sure that we're aware of changes. So we're always very thankful and appreciative of just even a simple email, and I try to make that as easy as possible. You literally just have to email me and be like, hey, this doesn't look right, and I will help you fix that. So I'll take care of that for you. So we try to make that as painless as possible. One thing that we have done in the last several years is to really try to adhere more stringently to some of the laws regarding the use of plain language to communicate government information. So what that means is that if you just talk to somebody, that's the way that we're trying to explain information online, so that we're not engaging a lot of that bureaucratic language that is inaccessible to a lot of different populations. So a lot of that really bureaucratic run-on sentence sort of language that we see straight from regulations. We're trying to hone that a little bit so the meaning stays true, but that we're communicating in a more effective language. So what else can I say? I think those are the main changes that we've seen in the last several years. And generally, every couple of years, we do an audit of different pieces of information on Wilderness Connect. Obviously, that's a year-long, if not longer, endeavor to redo a lot of the descriptory information, a lot of the review the regulatory pieces, those sorts of things. And one of the things that I think we are trying to work with agencies on here in the upcoming years, and that we're trying to prepare a toolbox to assist with, is to look at land acknowledgements and other sorts of language within the descriptions and the regulatory information of the for each wilderness, and to be able to bring that language up to some of the DEI standards that are occurring within the agencies. So happy to answer any questions, and I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat if you're not familiar with me personally, but any questions that you have, feel free to email me, and I will assist you in whatever you need. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks for all your good hard work with the wilderness.net. It is a very useful platform for all things wilderness. Just make a comment about the setbacks. So Griff, I was thankful that you mentioned talking to David Cole. Yeah, the setbacks do seem all over the board, and the rationale often is that local terrain, whether there's enough room, actual physical room, to put a campsite on a hillside or away from a lake basin. Some of those lake basins often are fairly narrow and confined, steep side walls, and unable to move 200 feet away from a lake basin or a river basin to have a campable spot. And so the variation is quite dramatic, having dealt with that situation in a number of wilderness areas that I was involved in. I wish there was a way we could get a little bit more consistency of either picking some banding, 50, 100, 200, versus the wide variety that we have. But, you know, every place is different and every situation is different. And I think managers put it at what they think is appropriate for their particular area. I think maybe that is an area where we could get some more research, though, to look at with GIS capabilities to look at campable spots around some of these places and to come up with a better, more standard package of setbacks that make sense in, you know, 95% of the situations, of allowing them for an opportunity for adjustments if you have one of those unique situations. Cindy Shinosky, hi Cindy, had asked a question about outfitter and guide use, and Griff responded that she did not look at outfitter and guide commercial use. The question had to do with, are there specific restrictions on outfitter use that tends to be focused and concentrated, sometimes having pretty site-specific impacts in a localized area. And while that wasn't part of this study, I just would add to that comment, Cindy, that each individual outfitter and guide has an operating plan that's identified by a local unit, a district ranger, and the wilderness manager would specify the parameters for that commercial use. It's within their purview to look at conditions on the ground and decide whether use in a particular area is causing too much impacts, not enough restrictions put on them, and to make adjustments accordingly. So they have the ability to change those operating plans according to the on-the-ground conditions. That's something that would need to be taken up with the local district ranger or their representative to certain that out. Oftentimes, though, it's part of the outfitters and guides historical use patterns. Often would put use on a particular trail, going to particular campsites based on their operating plan, the marketing that they've done for their operation, people's interests in going to particular places. And there might not be a lot of flexibility in some of those operations, but that's something that can be pursued at a local level. Let's see if we have any other questions.
One of the tricks about rules is you could make a rule before there's a problem. For the most part, people don't make a rule before there's a problem. And for example, in the Pacific Northwest, they ended up with like a ton of problems in maroon bells. They ended up with a ton of problems. And it isn't until they had a ton of problems that there was enough political support for them to then make more restrictive rules or make rules where rules didn't exist. In theory, over time, you'll be able to educate people through Leave No Trace to do better, do more good stuff and less bad stuff. And in theory, the agency will be able to undo those regulations. I suspect that that is a very challenging thing to find wildernesses where they've reduced the regulations, right? Instead, what ends up happening is you get more regulations and more regulations and more regulations. And so we end up moving further away from the goal of unconfined recreation. But if you have a massive quantity of people out there, as a manager, you get sort of stuck. The Wilderness Act requires you to keep wilderness where it was when you first did the baseline analysis. And so that may mean you do more restrictions in order to protect other things.
There's also a unique thing about many of these restrictions is that they tend to be historical in nature. And as people have identified particular regulations, other units in that particular area latch onto them and add them to their areas. And it's kind of what you become familiar with is what gets transferred into the regulations that are built upon in other parts of the country. And if you can see that dynamic play out by like the horses and heartbeats phenomena, where those regulations tend to be centrally focused in a certain location based on some research that was done in one area, then adopted by other managers in nearby areas. And sometimes those spread nationwide, but most oftenly they're localized or regional in nature and scope, and they're either supported or not supported by people in regional positions that then will help adopt them across the other areas within their area of concern or not. I think it'd be very interesting to kind of go through and track regulations over time across all these wilderness areas. And you could see that migration of managers as they move from place to place and implement different restrictions and regulations, and as the different research that's done in areas gets assimilated into the actual regulations applied to those areas.
Randy, and I think it's for that reason that we do have to sometimes circle back and look, and are these regulations still current? Do they really reflect what's happening on the ground? Because yeah, there could be, they've been adopted or grandfathered from other places. A case in point, well, maybe I'll get to, Mike Hurd had a comment that I want to touch upon here too, when we're talking about just relative impact, and he says it makes sense on the face of it that group size should be smaller and setbacks should be greater for stock versus hikers because of the greater impacts from stock. And I take that, Mike, to mean that in terms of a given party, like for example, overnight, we'd have to set up our high lines and have our animals and some space. But also there's the correct assumption too, that on a trail, let's say, that a single horse or mule exerts more pressure on a trail because they're a 1,000-pound animal than a person on foot would. I'd also want to add to that, though, it's not always a given that stock have a greater impact than hikers, because if you look at, well, for example, the Central Oregon Cascades here, and I think maybe Griff, what you were alluding to, this, what they called the Central Cascades Wilderness Strategies that was passed in the past 2 years. The clear problem in these wilderness areas was 99% of the overnight use in the Three Sisters, Mount Washington, and adjacent wilderness areas. 99% of that was people on foot. And we all cause an impact, just by our very presence in wilderness, no question. But we thought the solutions were rather inequitable that the Deschutes National Forest and Willamette Forest were implying, because we're 1% of the use. Even the scientists told us, oh, your impact is next to nothing. Yet the new regulations, go across the board. I'm not saying that the regulations shouldn't apply to every wilderness user, but I do ask managers to look at the relative proportions of uses. In this case, 1% of the use. Sure, it still exerts an impact, but if the problem really is the 99% of the users, let's focus the solutions on the uses that are causing the impact and really try to deal with that first and foremost. And that follows a basic premise from wilderness management and John Hendy and the original textbooks, and targeting the problems that are causing the impact. And we felt in this case, Central Cascades, sure, we're a component, but we're less than 1% or less than that. Let's not over-regulate stock use, because that seems to be the natural inclination of some managers.
Peter Keller, not to put you on the spot, but since you're here in our audience and you've seen from the research reports that the BLM regulations are somewhat spotty and may have some inconsistencies in them, what's your takeaway, and what would you like to share with the audience about BLM regulations, if you wouldn't mind coming on and just sharing your thoughts?
Randy, put me on the spot like that.
I know. Peter Keller, for everybody, is the national program leader for wilderness for the BLM. So he and I have a good relationship. So I feel comfortable putting him on the spot.
I'll have to pay you back sometime, or you can pay me back sometime, right? When we meet up there in Bend, right, at some point in the future when we're out of COVID, we can go hang out and see each other again. But this is just great for me. This is great information. I'm new to the position, a year or so here at the BLM, so I don't know everything that goes on in the field. But to see sort of the listing of these regulations has been really helpful. I've been taking a lot of notes and I'll be checking in, excuse me, with a lot of my field staff too, just to get a better idea of our regulations and that consistency and clarity. I thought, Griff, that you brought up, the may be required is a bit odd of a language. So that's something we need to definitely do a better job on in being clear in our websites, and also in directing people, as Randy noted, wilderness.net is our preferred one-stop shopping. So hopefully within our BLM websites, we have information that says, it's pointing people to the place we're putting that, instead of having to put multiple pieces of information across different areas. But I found a lot of this really very interesting, and I have a lot of good notes here to follow up with folks in our state offices.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter. And we know that you'll be on hand and take care of that for us. So let's go with we're at the top of the hour. Let's go with Griff and Randy. Any final comments before we close this session out? I'm not seeing any other questions.
I do
Oh,
have a question.
go ahead, Jean.
Sure, I'm Jean
Jean,
Clancy
go ahead.
with Backcountry Horsemen. I have a question with regard to outfitters, commercial outfitters in wilderness, and why some allow them and some don't. And is it based on historical use? I know in our local, our local Western Oregon Cascades, to my understanding, there are no commercial enterprises allowed. So what basis is that decision made?
Yeah, so Jean, that is an interesting question, a good question to ask for this conversation. It's a little bit outside the range of our particular subject today because we're not looking at commercial use, but let me just briefly say that commercial use in wilderness is established through a needs assessment that each of the local agencies is supposed to do, that identifies what kind of uses might be benefited by having a commercial use operation. Most of the commercial uses are sort of historical artifacts of people being granted permits to offer certain types of recreation opportunities with inside wilderness. And they've just built up and happened over time. Once they start to reach limits or reach places where there's enough public use that a commercial use isn't necessary, there are usually some sort of limits or cap placed on the commercial use. There's also all sorts of different allocation schemes that are in place to separate between commercial and non-commercial use. And typically, it all boils down to what the needs assessment at the local unit is as to whether and how much of commercial use is allowed versus private public use. So I hope that helps a little bit. So Griff and Randy, any final comments before we close?
Just a quick one on Jean's question too, that the agencies apply a necessary and appropriate test, for commercial services in wilderness, everything from photography, expeditions with groups to hiking, climbing, and includes, of course, the outfitters and guides that we know too. And that's been tried in the courts. I know High Sierra Hikers Association went after the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and other Sierra Nevada forests on that, and lost lawsuits because although the Wilderness Act prohibits commercial services operating within wilderness, it doesn't preclude, according to the courts, these operations that come from outside wilderness, bring people into experience wilderness and then leave. So I'm not doing the law justice, but the Ninth Circuits have upheld at least the legality of commercial services in wilderness. But as Randy said, it's up to the local unit to make that justification and set those limits locally.
And
yeah, the Wilderness Act does allow for commercial use in wilderness, but it does have some limits and restrictions. And so, Griff, sorry to cut you off.
It's kind of like grazing on public land. The manager has the authority to reduce the number of cattle on a grazing allotment. That said, dang, that takes a lot of political will, even if you know that there's biophysical damage. So anything that's a historical use, it's going to take a lot of political will for an agency to change what a commercial outfitter is doing, no matter whether they're commercial outfitting for hunting or fishing or packing in on horses. It's really hard to change those things. And unless you have a problem or people are arguing that, like particularly for rivers, they argue about too much use is going to commercial users as opposed, too many permits go to this way as opposed to private use. That doesn't typically happen, I don't think, with horseback use. So whatever you have is what you have, and it's a challenge for a manager to stand up and say, yeah, we can't have that level of use. In some cases, they can make the case for, we need to add more commercial use because now we've got way more people that want to use that. So you can see it growing, but it's really hard once people have a use in place to walk it back. They do it. I mean, they make rules where rules didn't used to exist, but there's a political cost to doing it in terms of public support. But they have to navigate that system as a manager because they're still charged with preserving wilderness character, even if it's not politically popular. That's it. Anyway, thanks for coming to the workshop. You know, it's a bunch of numbers, and you know, the big thing is at least you have a sense for what, if you didn't know what wilderness character monitoring was before, or if you didn't have a sense to whether stock is regulated frequently, you now have a sense for the kinds of regulations that you might encounter. And if you didn't know about wilderness.net, doggone it, now you do. And honestly, I email Lisa all the time and say, hey, this is a dead link, because the agency changed their website, and she changes it, 30 seconds later. So definitely use wilderness.net. I trust that Peter is going to get the BLM to get more rules on there. And the website will only grow in use. And it is a really good one-stop shopping for anybody who's going to use wilderness. So I can't say enough about wilderness.net as the way to go. We want them to become like Leave No Trace. Everybody knows, go there to learn X. So anyway, thanks for coming.
All right. Well, Griff and Randy, thank you so much for being our panelists today, sharing your information on stock use regulations within the Forest Service and the BLM. I'll just note for our audience that next week, Thursday, we have an NWSA coffee hour with author David Gesner, who will be talking about some of the concepts in some of the latest books about indigenous practices, indigenous Native American practices, and the role of Native Americans within national forests or within the wilderness, and the philosophy or the thoughts that are going on today about how we can better incorporate some of the historical cultural practices in wilderness and what that might look like. So it'll be an interesting, thought-provoking discussion. Please come join us with author David Gesner next week, January 20th, again at 1 o'clock Mountain Time. It'll be here on our NWSA coffee hour. So thanks, everybody. We're going to go ahead and close out.